Wow, you really went all out, huh? I mean, articles, research, I'm even seeing some, what are these, like handwritten training notes? This is awesome.
Yeah, it's a pretty good collection.
Okay, so our challenge, if we choose to accept it, is to basically become like strength and hypertrophy training ninjas,
Right.
but like fast track ninjas. We're going for the most important, most impactful stuff, right?
Exactly. Think of it this way. Less information overload, more laser-focused insights, you know? We're
Right.
going to distill it down to the core
So
principles.
no more feeling lost in the weeds. We're going to emerge from this like fully informed, ready to dominate.
That's the goal.
Love it. Okay, so for this deep dive, our primary source, one of the really big ones you gave us, is Christian Thibaudeau's Black Book of Training Secrets. This bad boy is from, wait for it, 2003.
Ah, a
A
classic.
classic, a total foundational text in the world of strength training. Now, what I love about Thibaudeau is he doesn't just tell you what to do, he really gets into the why, you know?
Oh, yeah, he's all about the reasoning, the underlying mechanisms.
Exactly, and I think that's what's going to make this so cool. We're going to uncover some stuff that might honestly surprise you about conditioning, about hypertrophy, even about the often overlooked power of, get this, your nervous system.
Yeah, that's actually one of the most interesting things about his approach. He really empowers you to understand the science behind it all, not just blindly following a program, but knowing why certain methods work, and more importantly, how to adapt them to your own individual needs. Right.
So powerful. Okay, let's jump right in. And I'm going to start with something that might ruffle some feathers. Aerobic work.
Hmm.
Traditional cardio. Thibaudeau, he doesn't exactly mince words, does he?
He's definitely got some strong opinions on that one.
Okay, lay it on us. What's the verdict?
Straight up, he argues that for most people, like the vast majority of us, long, slow cardio is basically overrated. Now, obviously, big exception here, if you're an endurance athlete. You know, marathon runner, triathlete, if that's your sport, then yeah, obviously you got to do it.
Makes sense. But for the rest of us, mere mortals who just want to be strong, be lean, be healthy, what's the alternative?
Thibaudeau is all about what he calls sport-specific conditioning. Think shorter bursts, higher intensity. He talks about 50 to 60-second sled sprints, 400-meter repeats with short rest periods, things like that.
Oh, so we're talking HIIT, high-intensity interval training.
Exactly. It's about challenging the anaerobic system, not just endlessly jogging for hours.
And he even uses a really interesting example in the book to illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah. He talks about Alex Tremblay. Right. This guy was, let me see, he was like a top scorer in Canadian university hockey. Tremblay had this like incredibly lean physique. And Thibaudeau credits that, at least in part, to these high-intensity conditioning methods. He even says Tremblay looked way leaner than a lot of natural bodybuilders.
So the takeaway is you don't need to spend your life on the treadmill to get shredded.
Nope. You can get lean and mean with short, intense bursts.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit now. Let's talk about muscle growth itself, hypertrophy. Thibaudeau introduces this concept of, and it's a really important distinction, non-functional hypertrophy. Break it down for us.
All right, so this is building on the work of guys like Dr. Millsif and Brian Haycock. Essentially, non-functional hypertrophy means you're gaining muscle size, but it's not really translating to a proportional increase in strength. You might look bigger, but you're not necessarily stronger in relation to that size.
So you could be packing on muscle that doesn't really help you lift heavier or move faster.
Yeah, essentially. It's like, think of it like a bodybuilder who looks jacked on stage, but can't actually move that much weight in the gym. It's all show, no go.
Okay, so how does that happen? Like what's going on at a cellular level?
So a couple things can contribute to this. One is growth in the non-contractile parts of the muscle cell, things like the sarcoplasm, which is the fluid inside the cell,
Okay.
or an increase in collagen, which is a type of connective tissue.
Right.
Now, that type of growth, it can make the muscle look bigger, but it's not adding to the actual force-producing capacity.
Gotcha.
And the other thing that can happen is the muscle fibers themselves might grow excessively large. And what can happen then is they start to experience like internal friction. So even though they have the potential to produce more force, they're kind of working against themselves.
That makes sense. And he uses a great analogy to explain this, doesn't
But
he?
yeah, the car analogy, he compares it to putting bigger tires on a car without actually upgrading the engine. The car might look more imposing, but it's not going to be any faster.
Love that analogy. So if we want muscle that actually does something, what should we be aiming for?
Functional hypertrophy, that's the key. It's about building muscle that directly translates to increased force production. So you're not just bigger, you're stronger, you're more powerful.
And how do we train for functional hypertrophy? What's the secret sauce?
It all comes down to creating high levels of intramuscular tension, lifting heavy, focusing on explosive movements. That's what forces the muscles to adapt in a way that actually increases strength.
And he gives us examples of athletes who typically display this type of functional muscle, right?
Oh, absolutely. He talks about the power lifters from Westside Barbell. Those guys are like the epitome of functional hypertrophy.
Right.
And elite Olympic weightlifters as well. Their training just demands that their muscles grow in a way that supports maximal force production.
Okay. Now, this leads to another really cool point he makes, which is the value of Olympic lifts, even for people who aren't necessarily trying to be, competitive weightlifters. Why does he think they're so beneficial, even for, say, bodybuilders?
Well, he argues that Olympic lifts offer a unique stimulus compared to the slower, more controlled movements that, bodybuilders typically focus on. He sees those lifts as a way to challenge muscle development from different angles, not just through constant tension, but also through, explosiveness, coordination, and that whole recruitment of a large number of muscle fibers at once.
It's like adding another dimension to your training.
Exactly. So even if your main goal is aesthetics, training like an athlete can actually be super beneficial for muscle growth.
Okay, that's a great takeaway. Don't be afraid to move some weight fast. So we've talked about functional hypertrophy. And now let's dig into what Thibaudeau considers the fundamental drivers of both strength and size gains.
Right.
He points to two key variables. What are they?
He talks about intramuscular tension and time under tension. That's often called TUT.
TUT. Okay, and of those two, which one does he place a greater emphasis on?
While TUT definitely plays a role, he's really clear that intramuscular tension is the primary driver. It's all about how much force those muscle fibers are actually generating.
Makes total sense, especially when you consider his focus on functional hypertrophy. It's about working those muscles hard.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into something you mentioned earlier, which is the nervous system. He seems to believe it's way more important in our training than most people realize.
No, totally. He even quotes Pavel Tsatsouline, the kettlebell guru. Tsatsouline says, your muscles already have the strength to lift a car, they just don't know it yet.
Whoa, powerful stuff.
Right, and that's exactly Thibaudeau's point. Our nervous system often limits us. It's like this bottleneck, preventing us from accessing the full potential of our muscles.
He also brings up those crazy real-life stories where, like a mom lifts a car to save her kid.
Yeah. Those stories where people do these superhuman feats of strength. And as Thibaudeau points out, they're not magically growing new muscle in that moment, are they? It's their existing muscles being pushed to their absolute limit, all because of this massive stress response.
The adrenaline kicks in, and bam.
Exactly. The nervous system just overrides all the usual limitations, and boom, you're suddenly way stronger than you thought possible.
So the takeaway is, we have way more strength than we think we do.
Yeah, and that's where the concept of the strength deficit comes in.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So the strength deficit is basically the gap between your absolute strength, like your theoretical maximum, and the strength you can actually voluntarily produce. And a big goal of training is to close that gap, to become more efficient at using the strength you already have.
So what dictates our ability to produce force?
Well, obviously the muscles themselves are a factor, like how big they are, what type of fibers they're made of.
Right.
But then there are also these things called muscle receptors, and they can actually act as inhibitory mechanisms, limiting how much force your nervous system allows you to generate. Think of them like safety brakes.
Safety brakes. Interesting. So what does this all mean for how we should train, especially if we want to get bigger?
Here's the key takeaway. If you're aiming for muscle size, don't neglect strength training and power training.
Oh, so it's not all about the pump.
Not entirely. See, strength and power training, they help to optimize your nervous system. They basically teach it to recruit muscle fibers more efficiently. And that can actually lead to more growth when you do focus on hypertrophy.
So you get stronger to get bigger.
Pretty much.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how do we even start figuring out our individual needs and capabilities so we can actually design a program that works for us?
This is where that whole evaluation process comes in, right? Thibaudeau really emphasizes this. You got to look at your weaknesses, your strengths, what you want to achieve, and your individual physiology. One-size-fits-all programs, rarely going to cut it.
We're all snowflakes, in a way.
Exactly. You need to know where you're starting from.
So how do we evaluate our nervous system? That doesn't seem like something you can measure with a regular gym scale.
He suggests using the strength deficit as an indirect assessment. Remember, a big strength deficit means your nervous system isn't super efficient.
Right. You're not tapping into all your muscle fibers.
Exactly. Small deficit usually means a more efficient system.
Okay, but how do we actually estimate that deficit?
Well, he gives this table in the book. It's based on your combined 1 rep max, your 1 RM for the squat and bench press divided by your body weight.
Okay.
Then you take that ratio and you categorize it based on your body type, like ectomorph, mesomorph, endomorph.
And your height too, right?
Yeah, height is a factor. So, for example, let's say you're a mesomorph, medium build, like somewhere between 5'7" and 6 foot.
All right.
And let's say your total 1 RM, so bench plus squat, divided by your body weight, comes out to less than 3.5 pounds per pound of body weight. That would be considered very poor.
Oof.
Yeah, it suggests a pretty significant strength deficit. Now, between 3.5 and 4.5 is poor, 4.5 to 5.5 is average, and then 5.5 to 6.5, that's when we start getting into the good range.
Good to know. So listeners, do the math, figure out where you stand. All right. Moving on from strength and the nervous system, Thibaudeau also spends some time talking about flexibility.
Right.
What's his take on that?
Well, he believes that having an optimal range of motion is super important. Not necessarily maximal flexibility, but just the right amount for each muscle group.
Makes sense.
And he talks about the relationship between agonist and antagonist muscles.
Agonist and antagonist. Remind me what those are again.
Sure. So agonist is the muscle that's doing the work, like the prime mover.
Mhm.
And the antagonist is the muscle that opposes it, helps control the movement.
Okay.
Now, what he points out is if you're super flexible in one muscle, like the agonist, you often have tightness or a limited range of motion in the opposing muscle, the antagonist.
And he gives a specific example of this.
Yeah, the classic one, tight hip flexors paired with weak, lengthened glutes and hamstrings. That's a common imbalance. And it can lead to not just cool performance, but also a higher risk of injury.
So it's all about balance, not just stretching everything to its absolute limit.
Exactly. Balance flexibility is key.
And actually, he argues that this balance in extensibility, in how well your muscles can lengthen, is more crucial for injury prevention than just having, balanced strength between opposing muscle groups.
Right. Because if both muscles in a pair have a similar level of tension and can lengthen appropriately, that creates a more stable joint.
Less likely to get hurt.
Exactly.
Okay, so how can we actually assess our flexibility? I mean, without going to see a specialist or anything.
Well, Thibaudeau outlines a bunch of really simple field tests you can do on your own.
Oh, cool.
Like for the iliopsoas, there's the Thomas test. You lie on your back, bring one knee to your chest,
Okay.
and then you see what the other leg does. It should be hanging off the table, right? If the thigh lifts up, that suggests tight hip flexors. If it hangs way down, you might be hyperextensible.
Interesting.
But he does say you got to watch out for arching your lower back during the test. That can give you a false positive.
Yeah, good tip. What about the rectus femoris? How do you test that one?
That's the modified Thomas test. Basically the same setup, but you let the lower part of that hanging leg bend at the knee. The angle of the lower leg tells you about the rectus femoris. Around 80 degrees is normal. Less means tightness. More means you're super flexible.
Gotcha. What about those hamstrings? Always a tricky one.
For the spinal erectors and hamstrings, he talks about the classic toe touch test. But he breaks it down in a really interesting way.
Go ahead, I'm listening.
So if you can't bend much in your lower back, but you're rounding your upper back a lot, that suggests tight lumbar erectors.
Right.
But if your upper back stays flat and you're still limited in your lower back, that might be the thoracic erectors that are tight. And obviously, if you're bending your knees a lot to reach your toes, that means tight hamstrings.
Those are really helpful nuances to the classic toe touch test.
Right. And then he also talks about tests for hip and shoulder rotation, which are often problem areas for people.
Oh, yeah, those are important.
So for hip rotation, you lie on your back, one leg bent, and you passively rotate the hip inwards. 45 degrees is considered normal. Less means tightness, more means hyperextensible.
Hey.
For the shoulders, you lie on your back, arm out to the side, elbow bent, and you let your forearm fall towards the table. Ideally, it should reach the table. If it doesn't, that suggests tightness in the internal shoulder rotators.
Fascinating.
And if it goes way past the table, you're hyperextensible.
So these are all things we can do right now at home to get a better sense of our own flexibility.
Exactly.
Love it. Okay, let's shift gears now. Let's talk about the science of force production. He gets into the nitty-gritty physics of it all, doesn't he?
Oh, he does. He stresses how important it is to understand that producing force is the basis of pretty much every athletic action. And he also makes a clear distinction between force, which is the actual tension you generate, and strength, which is your capacity to produce that force.
Strength is like the potential, and force is what you actually do with it.
That's a great way to put it.
I paid attention in physics class. Okay, so then he brings in that classic equation, FMA.
Force equals mass times acceleration.
High school physics, coming back to haunt us. But in a good way.
He explains that the total force you create during a movement is a combination of the force you need just to move the weight, that's the mass part, and the force needed to accelerate it.
Okay, so if you want to increase force, you can either lift heavier or move the same weight faster.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. And then he goes on to categorize different training methods based on whether they emphasize, acceleration or mass.
Right. He lays out this spectrum with ballistic methods at one end. Those are all about high speed, low mass. Think jumping, throwing, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And then on the other end, you have supramaximal methods. Those are the opposite. It's about moving really heavy weights, but very slowly, like trying to lift more than your 1 rep max. And in between, you have a whole range of methods. Speed strength, strength speed, controlled reps, and maximal strength training. They all fall somewhere along that spectrum, depending on the balance of load and speed.
Okay, so why is this important to understand? What's the practical application of this FMA stuff?
Well, first off, it helps you design a smarter training program. You can avoid doing a bunch of exercises that all target the same qualities.
You're not just wasting time.
Right. And it also helps you progress safely and effectively. You can manipulate both load and acceleration to challenge yourself.
So it's not just about adding more weight all the time.
Nope. You can get creative. And ultimately, I think understanding these principles just gives you a deeper understanding of what each exercise is actually doing.
You become more mindful of your training.
Exactly. You're not just randomly picking exercises. You're training with a purpose.
I like that.
Oh.
Okay, can you give us a quick recap of those 6 basic force training methods he outlines?
All right, so ballistic training is high velocity, low resistance. It's mainly for developing power. Speed strength is also high velocity, but it's more focused on the type of power that's useful for athletic movements. Strength speed uses moderate velocity and moderate resistance. It's about being able to produce force quickly. Controlled reps, those are your typical, moderate weight, moderate speed lifts, good for building muscle mass and tendon strength. The maximal strength method is low velocity, high resistance, and that's all about increasing your 1 rep max. And then finally, supermaximal training uses very low speed and very high weight. It's really demanding on the nervous system, but it can help you break through plateaus.
Gotcha. And he also discusses some other strength training methods that don't quite fit into that, acceleration versus mass framework.
Yeah, like eccentric training where you really focus on the lowering phase of the lift.
Okay.
That can build serious strength, especially in the tendons.
Makes sense.
He also talks about isometric training, which is basically holding a maximal contraction against an immovable object.
Like pushing against a wall.
Exactly. And of course, he emphasizes the importance of heavy lifting, using those 85 to 100% of your 1 rep max weights.
That's got to be in there somewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's crucial for maximizing muscle strength and really challenging your nervous system.
He gives some specific advice about heavy lifting too, right? Like how to choose the right exercises and all that.
Yeah, he says to focus on those big compound movements. Squats, bench presses, deadlifts.
The big 3.
And he stresses that you gotta be smart about your volume and frequency with heavy lifting because it's so demanding.
Easy to overdo it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
He even provides guidelines for tapering before a competition, like how much to reduce your training volume and intensity depending on the weights you've been using.
Okay.
And he includes a modified version of Prilepin's table, which is this guideline for choosing the optimal number of sets and reps at different intensity percentages.
So it's like a cheat sheet for planning your heavy lifting.
Pretty much.
Love it. Okay, we've got all these different training methods. How do we actually organize them over time to maximize progress? Enter periodization.
Periodization. Crucial concept.
What is it all about?
Well, Thibaudeau's point is you shouldn't be trying to do everything at once.
Makes sense.
You got to cycle through different training stresses to keep your body adapting. He talks about 4 main training periods. Early preparatory, late preparatory, competitive, and in-season.
Okay.
And he has this table that shows how to emphasize each of those training methods we talked about, depending on what period you're in.
So it's like a roadmap for planning your training year.
Exactly. And then within that overall plan, he talks about using training blocks.
Ox.
Yeah, training blocks are basically these focused periods where you have a specific goal.
Okay.
And he outlines this 4-week block structure. You start with an introductory week to prep the body, then a base loading week with higher volume,
Right.
then a shock loading week, which is higher intensity but lower volume. And finally, an unloading week for recovery, and maybe some testing to see how you're progressing.
So it's like a cycle within a cycle.
Yeah, and the main exercises usually stay the same within a block, but then you switch them up when you move to the next block.
Keeps things fresh.
Exactly. And he gives some really cool examples of these 4-week blocks tailored to different goals, like blocks for athletic development, blocks for strength, and blocks for bodybuilding. He even breaks it down for people with different muscle fiber types.
So whether you're trying to get jacked or dominate on the field, he's got you covered.
He does. And he even gives a sample weekly workout schedule for athletes, so you can see how this all fits together.
That's so helpful. Okay, so we've got these blocks, but how do we decide how hard to actually push ourselves during each workout? How do we plan the intensity?
Intensity. Super important. And Thibaudeau actually makes some really important distinctions here.
I'm all ears.
He says training intensity, like the scientific definition, is the load you're using as a percentage of your 1-rep max. But then there's training intensiveness, which is about using methods that really fatigue you.
Right.
Then there's just the feeling of being intense.
Like psyching yourself up.
Exactly. He's very clear that for planning your program, you got to use the scientific definition.
Be precise.
Exactly. And he actually prefers using the repetition maximum, or RM system, for planning rather than just fixed percentages.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, the RM system is more, auto-regulatory.
It adjusts to your body on that particular day.
Right. Some days you're stronger, some days you're not.
Makes sense.
A fixed percentage could be too easy one day, too hard the next.
So you got to listen to your body.
Always. He briefly mentions that Poliquin percentage chart, but says it has limitations, especially because everyone has a different muscle fiber makeup.
Right. Not everyone responds to the same stimuli in the same way.
Exactly.
Okay, so what else does he talk about when it comes to planning intensity?
Well, he briefly touches on the idea of using loading and unloading cycles. Yeah, like a 3-week loading phase where you gradually increase the stress, followed by a 1-week unloading phase for recovery. That can be really effective for preventing overtraining.
So you build up, then you back off a little, then build up again.
Exactly.
And what about training frequency? How often should we be hitting each muscle group?
That's another thing he talks about. He says you got to find a balance between the total volume you're doing for a muscle group and how often you're training it.
Okay.
He warns against doing too much volume in one session. It can mess with your recovery.
Yeah, if you're constantly sore, that's probably a sign you're overdoing it.
Exactly. He gives the example of a 4-day split, 2 upper body workouts, 2 lower body workouts, with at least 48 hours of rest between sessions that work the same muscles.
Recovery is key.
Totally.
Okay, now for something a little more out there. Training twice a day.
Twice a day training.
Thibaudeau seems to be a fan, under the right circumstances.
Yeah, he mentions that he actually prefers shorter, more frequent training sessions.
Interesting. What are the advantages of that?
Well, he says it can boost motivation because the sessions are shorter. You can also potentially maintain higher work quality throughout.
Okay.
And you burn more calories. You might recover faster between sessions. And some people, like those who are more fast twitch dominant or have really efficient nervous systems, might respond better to this kind of training.
But he also lays out some pretty specific guidelines for doing this effectively, right?
Oh, yeah. He's very clear about that. Morning session should be around 30 to 40 minutes. Evening session, 20 to 30 minutes.
Okay.
You should train the same muscle group both times, but with a different focus.
How so?
Morning is for functional movements like heavy lifts, explosive exercises. Evening is more structural, so higher volume, lighter weight, slower tempo.
Makes sense.
And post-workout nutrition after each session is super important.
Fuel those gains.
And he generally recommends hitting each muscle group only once per week when you're doing this split. So you might pair muscle groups or train a single muscle group per day.
This sounds like a pretty advanced technique. Not for beginners, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it's definitely not for everyone, but if you do it right and you pay attention to his guidelines, he thinks it can be really effective for both muscle gain and getting lean. He even suggests trying it out for like 4 weeks to see how your body responds.
Test drive those twice-a-day workouts. I love it. All right, let's move on to something that seems kind of basic but is often overlooked. Rest intervals between sets.
Yeah.
How important are they really, and how do we know how long to rest?
They're actually more important than people realize. And Thibaudeau's big point is your rest intervals should be based on your training goal and your predominant muscle fiber type.
Okay, so like, are you more fast twitch or slow twitch dominant?
Exactly. And he provides these really detailed tables in the book showing the recommended rest intervals for different adaptations.
Adaptations?
Yeah, like whether you're training for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is increasing the fluid in the muscle cell, or total hypertrophy, which is growing the muscle fibers themselves, or functional hypertrophy, strength endurance, power development. He breaks it all down for both fast twitch and slow twitch dominant individuals.
So those rest times can vary a lot depending on your goals and your physiology.
Absolutely. And he also explains how those different rest intervals affect, like, your physical recovery between sets, your nervous system recovery, and even the hormonal response to training.
So it's about way more than just catching your breath.
Oh, yeah, it's a really strategic part of training.
All right, let's focus specifically on bodybuilding now. Thibaudeau has some really interesting tips that go beyond just lifting heavy, right?
Yeah, he emphasizes this really important shift in mindset for hypertrophy. It's not just about lifting the most weight, it's about the quality of the muscle contraction. You really got to feel the muscle working.
That mind-muscle connection.
Exactly. And he gives 5 specific methods for maximizing this training quality.
Lay them on us.
All right, so the first one is maximal static contraction, or MSC. This is where you squeeze the muscle as hard as you can at the top of the movement, hold it for a couple seconds, really feel that peak contraction.
Okay.
Then there's constant maximal tension, CMT. Here, you're trying to maintain maximal tension throughout the entire rep, lifting, holding, lowering. Think of it like one long pose.
Gotcha.
Then he talks about including stretch movements in your routine, exercises where the muscle gets fully stretched that can help activate more muscle fibers. He recommends doing a couple of these per muscle group.
Okay.
The fourth key is the pump. Everyone loves the pump, right? But it's not just about feeling good, it's actually helping to deliver nutrients to muscles and boost the anabolic response.
The pump is functional.
Exactly. He suggests doing pump sets, like drop sets, towards the end of your workout.
After you've done the heavy lifting.